The ancient Greeks put much emphasis on learning and education in their society. Their emphasis, however, was not on vocation. What was its main focus then? We will be diving into the pedagogy of classical education and its recent rise in popularity with Dr. Steve Turley. Dr. Steve Turley is an internationally recognized scholar, speaker, and is a classical guitarist. He's an author writing over 20 books, including Awakening Wonder, a classical guide to truth, goodness, and beauty, and Classical versus Modern Education, a vision from C.S. Lewis, whose subject matter we will be discussing in this episode. Dr. Steve Turley was a professor of fine arts at the Eastern University and a faculty member at Delaware Valley Classical School in Newcastle, Delaware, where he teaches theology and rhetoric. Steve also hosts a popular YouTube channel with daily content that details the rise of nationalism, populism, and traditionalism throughout the world. You can find out more about him at turleytalks.com. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Steve Turley, for joining us.
Oh, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here with you, Tim.
Yeah, so first, could you give us a history or background on classical education, and what essentially its key purpose is?
Yeah, real briefly, classical education is an education that began in Athens around 4th century. Perhaps it's better to say it really picked up right around that time. That'd be sort of its golden age. And this kind of education tended to focus not so much on getting the student to acquire skills, what they might call vocation at the time, or what we would call vocational education, but rather it focused more on cultivating wisdom and virtue in the life of the student. So classical education, and there's a whole logic as to why, but generally speaking, the way of thinking about classical education is that it was a kind of education that envisioned an educated person as a virtuous person, which is, it's a pretty radical concept today. But it was a vision of education that really lasted with us from that, say, 4th century BC all the way up to the late 19th or beginning of the 20th century. The notion that an educated person is a wise person and a virtuous person.
So with classical education, how has it shaped Western civilization in our culture, during that time, our sense of morality and our values?
Inordinately, extraordinary amount, because in many respects, the reason why the focus is so central on wisdom and virtues, because education was seen as the means of cultivating something called cosmic piety within students. And cosmic piety is this sort of fancy term that scholars have coined that refers to the notion that the world is filled with divine meaning and purpose, and therefore every person born into the world is born into a kind of divine obligation. We're obliged to conform our lives into a harmonious relationship with that divine meaning and purpose. And so our culture, our civilization that gets built around that notion ends up becoming tangible, material expressions of this divine meaning and purpose. And so the ancient Greeks, the Romans after them, the Christian civilization following, and in many respects, just broadly speaking, sort of all pre-modern cultures and civilizations around the world, they were very intentional in initiating students into this particular material, cultural, substantial vision of cosmic piety. And so, and again, an educated person would be one who fulfilled that cosmic piety. They fulfilled it in terms of they understood the divine meaning and purpose inherent in the world around them. And the name for that would be wisdom. But they also embodied it in the sense of this cosmic piety, in the sense of they aligned their loves and their desires in accordance with that wisdom. And that would be called virtues. So Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, they all define virtue in terms of this notion of ordo amoris, or ordered loves. And so an educated person was one who could maintain the culture, who was a custodian of culture and civilization at its highest level, And therefore, they fostered this notion that culture is this tangible embodiment of cosmic piety for future generations. And so it didn't matter whether you were dealing with literature or art or architecture, music or poetry or politics or economy, or all kind of sort of bound together in liturgical expressions in the church. Whatever it was, they were tangible expressions of this divine meaning and purpose that invited our loves, our desires to be aligned in accordance with this particular vision of meaning and purpose. So again, the educated person in a classical sense was the wise and virtuous person, precisely because they were the ones who could be entrusted with the custodian and the maintenance and indeed the advancement of culture and civilization in its literary and artistic and musical and architectural and political and legal forms.
Yeah, so this is fascinating. So, given classical education's central focus on, cosmic piety or divinity, if you want to call it that, so what subjects and material would a student be taught then? And, and how in classical education would we understand math, grammar, or music?
Yeah, it's a great question. The curriculum for a classical student is very similar to what we have today in terms of that whole reading, writing, and arithmetic, but they had a bit more of a profound conception of it. So it tended to get developed into something called the 7 liberal arts. And that's what we still see today in colleges that bill themselves as liberal arts institutions or liberal arts colleges. We don't mean liberal in the political sense, in its modern political sense. We mean liberal in the sense that it frees us. These are the arts, or even technically they would be known as techniques or subjects that free us from our ignorance, and the ignorance that prevents us from realizing our highest human aspirations, which are always culturally expressed. So those 7 liberal arts, 3 of them dealt with language and the other 4 dealt with math. So language would be grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And the 4 with math would be arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And notice even the way they conceived of, they organized the arts. Music and math were kind of connected together. Today we tend to separate them. So math and geometry, they would be part of the sciences, as it were, and music would be pushed off into the humanities. Well, they saw music as a sonic expression of mathematical principles. Mathematics would have been seen in the ancient world more as the patterns of perfection upon which the entire universe was modeled. And it all goes back to this notion in the Greek world of logos. The Chinese had this notion of Tao. And it's this order, it's this principle of order that both speaks meaning into the world, but also that orders and arranges in metrical fashion the world. So the Greeks referred to it as logos. Another way of looking at it for Avatar fans is you have, the 4 elements of the cosmos: earth, air, fire, and water. But the question was, what bound them all together? What gave them a sense of meaning and order? And that kind of quintessence, that 5th element, the Greeks would call logos. Logos could refer to word, but it can also refer to the order of things. So we use the word logistics in that way. And so if you have word and order, you sort of a metrical word or a linguistic kind of measurement, well, then naturally then your curriculum is going to revolve around a kind of trivium and quadrivium, a kind of word-centered study in your grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and a sort of number-centered study in your arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. So those would be sort of your main subjects that students would study, and those were 7 ways in which we could understand that divine meaning and purpose, and then cultivate and align and order our loves in accordance with that divine meaning and purpose.
So, ordering our loves, could you talk a little bit more about that? Because I know in your books you mention it quite a bit. And just to quote you, you said it's understanding the world comparable to the way in which the gods perceived it.
Yeah. The right. It can be in many ways embodied by that Latin term from which we derive the term contemplation. So contemplation goes back to the word contemplare, to think thoughts in accordance with the temple. And so thinking in this sense is a very sacred act. It's an act by which I can understand the world in terms of its divine meaning and purpose, as the Greeks would say, as the gods would have understood it. And in its Christian development, as God himself, the one true and living God, understands it as revealed in Christ and by the power of the Holy Spirit. So the way it works is the love part fits in with the piety part. So if you've got this notion of cosmic piety, the world's filled with divine meaning and purpose, and therefore every person is obligated to conform their lives in their harmonious relation with that divine meaning and purpose. And then culture is sort of the bridge that brings together your knowledge of this divine meaning and purpose that you see in a culture's architecture, its art, that you hear in its poetry and its music, that you encounter in its laws, sense of justice, righteousness, and the like. Its notion of family, its notion of gender, fashion, festival, calendar. Those things reveal the divine meaning and purpose inherent in the world as the culture understands it. But that's only half of it, because the gods expect a sense of fidelity on our part. They expect a sense of reverence and awe, that there are certain things that are higher in value than others, and that a truly educated person is one that recognizes that economy of values. So I like to ask my students this: is it good to love a baby? And they'll all say sure. And then I might ask, is it good to love a ham sandwich? And well, those who aren't vegetarians will say, yeah, sure, of course, right? I don't even look at vegetarians. So, it's still good to, hey, you don't want to eat the ham, that's fine, but it's still good. But I asked them, but if they're both falling at the same time and I rush to save the ham sandwich, why is that bad? And the students will eventually get it, because a baby is of infinite more value than the ham sandwich. And so it's bad not because of anything inherent in the baby or in anything inherent of the ham sandwich. When both are falling and I rush to say the ham sandwich, that's bad because I dislodged my desires, my goals, my loves, my inclinations, my dispositions, apart from this divine economy of goods. And so the Greeks were very aware that all kinds of problems can happen when our desires have been dislodged from good things. I like to contrast the two stories of the Muses and the Sirens. And in Greek mythology, the Muses are the 12 daughters of Zeus who inspire acts of truth, goodness, and beauty that awaken our loves to be filled with the true and the good. But sirens use a fake beauty to lure sailors in particular. They're the sea nymphs that draw sailors to their death. And so if we don't train our loves rightly, what we can end up doing is ironically disordering God's economy of goods. We can be putting lesser things above greater things, and therefore impede our human flourishing and impede our cosmic piety. So the ancients took our loves and our dispositions and our inclinations very, very seriously, because they saw them as the virtue side of developing wisdom and hence fulfilling our cosmic piety.
Oh, interesting. You mentioned, going from the ancient Greeks, and then Christian civilization adopted many of these themes. Could you get into that a little bit, and also how classical education evolved into modern times?
Yeah, so Christians tapped into this classical education. They tapped into this world primarily through the Apostle Paul, who in his letter to the Ephesian church exhorted fathers to raise their children in what's called the paideia of the Lord. The paideia is a Greek term. We use it when we take our kids to the pediatrician. Pedia basically means child in Greek, but paideia or a pedia can also mean an educational project that intentionally seeks to initiate students into a particular kind of culture. And Paul's very clear in Ephesians that students or children of Christians should be paideiaed into a distinctively Christian culture. So the church took that very seriously in the 2nd, 3rd centuries in places like Alexandria and Rome and Edessa and Antioch, where they built schools and institutions that could help educate students into a distinctively Christian vision of life. And what they did is they took the texts that were very special to the Greeks, like Homer and Hesiod, and other texts that were very important to the Romans, so like Virgil and Ovid, and they kept them because they saw them as very good and powerful expressions of cosmic piety, but they relativized those texts to their sacred texts, which would be Old Testament, New Testament. So now all classical education gets reoriented around Christ, who is indeed the Logos, the one in whom all things hold together in John's theology, as well as in Paul. Paul says Christ is the one in whom all things cohere. And so then Christian classical education starts replacing some of the Greek assumptions like polytheism, sees those more as angels and demons as opposed to actual gods. And they start to see the human person created more in the image of God, as opposed to just simply being a microcosm of the true, the good, and the beautiful in sort of a, I don't want to say a nefarious sense, but for Plato, truth, goodness, and beauty really didn't care about you. It certainly wouldn't die for you. And so all you had to do was tap into philosophy, right? The love of wisdom. Notice virtue and wisdom in there. Love of wisdom, rightly ordered loves. You had to tap into that philosophy in order to be saved, as it were, in order to escape your human impediments and realize your true humanity by encountering the true, the good, and beautiful in spiritual form. Christians saw truth, goodness, and beauty fully embodied in Christ, who loves humanity and who seeks to restore humanity's image of God that's been marred because of sin. So education, the classical education takes on a different orientation, but it's still very much the same in terms of its emphasis on grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and your arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, your trivium and your quadriviums, 7 liberal arts, and the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, but now in more distinctively Christian terms. And that's normative for the Western world, and I would include Russia and Byzantium as part of that sort of big picture Western world. That's pretty much normative all the way up into the 19th century. They were using Boethius's music theory. Boethius is an amazing music theorist who took the music theory of Pythagoras, who understood music as that which held the entire world together in terms of frequencies and sounds, and therefore the music that we compose is supposed to sort of reawaken that music for us so that we can embody a cosmic harmony and realize our cosmic piety. Boethius Christianized that, and his music theory was taught in Oxford all the way up to the tail end of the 19th century. So this is very much a normative conception of education in our Western context. What we have now is actually quite the deviation, and it's a relatively recent one, which I'm assuming you want to go into next.
Yeah, definitely. So you detail C.S. Lewis's vision in his book, The Abolition of Man, on the differences in classical and modern education. So could you fill us in on that?
Yeah, C.S. Lewis is The Abolition Man. Fantastic book for anyone to read. It's only about 80 pages, but it is hard reading. There's a lot of Latinate phrases, some Greek phrases in there. So I did write a bit of a companion sort of to help the reader get through it. But yeah, you got it. C.S. Lewis was critiquing the state of British education in the 1940s. And he recognized that what was passing as modern education was sort of a radical inversion of what would have been an educated person in this 2,500-year classical tradition. And he summed it up beautifully. He said, in the classical world, the chief question that the classical mind would ask is, how do I conform my soul to the divine meaning and purpose all around me, right? Simple question of cosmic piety. And the answer was by cultivating wisdom and virtue. In the modern world, that question gets inverted. It's not so much a question of how do I conform the divine meaning and purpose, how do I conform my soul to divine meaning and purpose around me? The modern mind asks a very different question. It asks, how do I conform the world, which is meaningless and purposeless because it's just simply biological, chemical, and physical nature, nothing more? How do I conform that world to my own desires and my own ambitions? And you see here, wisdom and virtue are really not going to help you with that project. So you have a different answer for a different value system. And the answer is through tapping into those institutions that operate by the mechanisms of manipulation, namely science, technology, and a secularized state. So the modern mind is very much concerned with technocracy and technical skill for the student so as to be able to better manipulate and conform the world around us to our own desires and our own ambitions. So classical education, modern education, ironically, actually have fundamentally different conceptions of the world, fundamentally different conceptions of the human person, and hence fundamentally different conceptions of what it means to be educated.
And, I have to ask, with the classical education's focus on right conduct, ethics, virtue, and you as being a classical educator, do the kids behave? Do you run into a lot of those issues, or what's a day like in teaching classical education?
Yeah. Oh, they're horrible. Forget it. They're all moderns. Yeah. No, it's an excellent question. Generally speaking, because the emphasis is so much on wisdom and virtue, you do create a culture of wisdom and virtue that the faculty you have to model, that the families are called to model, and then the students do as well. And so discipline issues are just not a big thing in classical schools, generally speaking. All the classical schools that I've been around across the country and even in the world, I was privileged to be at a conference in Brazil among families that were starting one of the first classical schools in Sao Paulo. It's stunning because you're really seeing the fruits of the emphasis of cosmic piety in the lives of students. And of course, they all go through adolescence. Of course, they all go through they go through their modern period, their modern, what I like to call Marxist period, where they deconstruct everything. They try to deconstruct everything as if, well, all these rules are here just because white men have the power to shove them down our throats. All music is equally valid. There's no music that's better than any other kind of music. All literature is cultural. So if I'm ethnic, I should only be reading my own ethnic literature. That's all Marxism. Marxism is all about deconstructing things in terms of power discrepancies. Oh, you'll see that too. That's part of the air we breathe. What's beautiful about a classical school, however, is it provides the space we can engage that kind of thinking in light of truth, goodness, and beauty. And I think expose that kind of thinking for the absolute and utter absurdity that it is. Because, of course, that kind of thinking is itself nothing more than the product of somebody else's power discrepancies being imposed on the student. It doesn't stop with Plato and suddenly now you're okay. No, it goes all the way back to your rap music that you're listening to, or it goes all the way to the pop culture that you're devoting your life to, or the social media. They are imposing their corporate power on you. And so you're able to sort of deconstruct the deconstructivist, as it were. And then you can say, and you also notice that you're assuming the world has no divine meaning and purpose. You're assuming all culture is arbitrary and just power discrepancies. But you're assuming, you see, there's no divine meaning and purpose. And if you assume that, then why can't I exercise power on you? After all, you're just biology, chemistry, and physics and nothing more. Or you can see yourself as created in the image of God. You could see yourself as infinitely sacred and who've been bought with a price and have been redeemed and restored by infinite and eternal love embodied in Christ. Which world do you want? So it's very powerful. The school becomes an astonishing space to deal with some of the fundamental and most challenging issues of life. But you don't have faculty that just looks at you and say, oh, well, whatever, just make sure you study hard enough so you can pass your SAT, and make sure you're tolerant and the like. That kind of space is the problem, not the solution.
Yeah, so when we're talking about modern education, I don't know if it's you or C.S. Lewis, I get this mixed up, but I'll just quote it here. So,
and I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, okay. The quote, if a sense of divine obligation and hence self-government has been erased, then only coercion, compulsion, and extortion can provide a motivation for ethical conformity, unquote. And this was on modern education, and it gets into C.S. Lewis talking about the manipulatees and the manipulators.
Yeah.
So in modern education, do you think that's essentially what they're doing?
Yeah. No. Absolutely. So what the brilliance of Lewis, what he drew out in his Abolition of Man, was the recognition that if we do not have virtue, then we cannot be shocked to find the lack of virtue in our society. One of his famous phrases is, we can't amputate and then demand the function. We can't teach our students that truth is relative and then be shocked to find that politicians lie to us, right? Or we can't teach our students that all morality is relative and situational and then be shocked to find out that our bankers and corporate executives are making their decisions on nothing else but greed and expediency. We can't teach our students that beauty is in the eye of the beholder solely, and then be shocked to find a urinal as part of an art exhibit, like Duchamp's urinal back in the 1920s. This is the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem is we're teaching students that virtue no longer matters because there's no divine meaning and purpose. If there's no divine meaning and purpose, there's no wisdom to cultivate. If there's no wisdom, then there is no virtue. There's no objective basis with which to align my loves. You like babies, I like ham sandwiches. Let's move on, right? So we're reaping the whirlwind of that right now, and we don't know really what to do with it. And so the terrible consequence of that is then tyrannical. Then the only way you get people to ethically conform at a mass level is not through appealing to a sense of truth, goodness, and beauty. It's not appealing to a sense of the highest aspirations of what it means to be human, that's lovely and noble and praiseworthy, that evokes my loves and draws them and orders them around a divine economy of goods. No, that lack of virtue now, the lack of virtue is replaced with virtue signaling. And if the listeners know what virtue signaling is, we see it against Chick-fil-A, we see it against anything conservative, we see it against the patriarchal system and the racist system. Well, it's basically Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She is the embodiment of virtue signaling, where you've got these fingers pointed at you. And if you do not walk the line as you ought to, then you are a racist, you are a bigot, you are a homophobe, you are a hater, you're intolerant, and you are therefore allowed to be excommunicated from our new enlightened liberal society. What we have to understand is when virtue is replaced with virtue signaling is bullying. That's what it is. So if we're not taught to make our decisions freely as a fruit of a wise and beautiful and true and good life, then the only way we're going to get mass conformity in our behavior is through compulsion, coercion, and manipulation. And that's precisely what we're seeing today.
So in the classical world, again, this is going back to a focus on virtue and the institutions of classical education. Do you think if classical education is the norm, or at least you put the emphasis on virtue in education, here in the West, we've had relatively a stable society, that people want to immigrate to. Do you think that, this all stems from education? What's your take on this?
Yeah, I think education is a part of it. It's part of a whole. So I don't think it's education itself. I think it's part of an overall civilizational commitment to cosmic piety. That overall civilizational commitment to cosmic piety gets a cultural civilizational expression. The cultural civilizational expression is then maintained and perpetuated and advanced through a new generation that has been paideid in it, that's been initiated into it through a kind of education where the student learns to be embody a particular kind of human, a particular kind of vision of what it means to be human, so as to be able to perpetuate this cultural civilizational expression of cosmic piety. What's happened in the last 2 centuries, particularly through radical secularization in the 18th century and then its Marxist outworking in the 19th century, is that culture has been called wicked. That culture has been attacked as racist and homophobic and bigoted and the like. And what we're finding is that we're now dividing up into 2 groups. One group that says that your culture that this traditional Western culture is inherently racist, bigoted, intolerant, and another group that's trying to maintain it and hold it together in the midst of that storm, and then is finding and rediscovering the very kind of education that was designed to perpetuate and protect that culture. So that's why I think you're seeing classical education just explode today in all kinds of wonderful ways.
Okay, let's get into that real quick here. So in our scene right now, as you said, there's an explosion of classical education. Is this because people are moving away from the public, education sphere? What are they trying to go to?
Yeah, it's a good question. I tend to see it in light of this larger sociological phenomenon known as retraditionalization. It's a bit of a cumbersome word, but it's a neat concept. And what we're finding is that in the midst of these assaults on culture, custom, tradition, and nation, substantial portions of populations, they're just not convinced by the modernist, Marxist, globalist critique. They're not convinced by it, so they're actually re-embracing custom, culture, tradition as mechanisms of resistance against what they see as really these anti-cultural processes of cultural Marxism, globalism, secularism, and the like. And so it's very organic, it seems to me. It's very organic that it's just a natural way of looking at education. Okay, how have we done it in the past? Because the past seems to be a guide for how to best flourish in the future. Remember, the Marxist hates the past. For the Marxists, everything is in the future. Everything is this bright hope. And again, I see all leftists as Marxists, basically. So I don't use the term Marxist in a very limited, economic sense. I see it as a worldview sense of deconstructing cosmic piety and as inherently evil, and then embracing this notion of the age of reason to usher us into a future utopia. The classical mind deeply reveres history because it sees it as very good and devout and faithful expressions of cosmic piety, to be advanced, no question, to develop, no question, to correct in ways, no question, but always done within this kind of realm of fidelity. And I think one of the first things we saw was in the 60s and 70s a return to home education. So people started looking at home education as the primary way they could preserve the sense of tradition and custom and culture that's sacred, that's pious, and the like, as over and against its secular assaults. But then around 1980, I think it was Doug Wilson in Moscow, Idaho, pastor out there. He came across Dorothy Sayers' essay, I think from the 1940s, if I recall, called The Lost Tools of Learning, which she talks about the medieval trivium and quadrivium and how this classical education was so influential in creating a distinctively Western civilization over the course of 2,500 years. And he said, that's it. We're going to do that for our kids. They started a school. A couple of schools came out of it to model it. And then a lot of people, thank God for the age of the internet, a lot of people hear about it. They're getting the tapes and so forth. And then they want to start creating those schools. So by 1994, if I recall, there were about 10 classical schools in the country. And today there are over 500. And so it's not even so much like just leaving public schools or anything like that. I think it's just this very organic sense of, let's go back to the way we've been doing it for 2,500 years. That's when we find our wisdom and virtue that can guide us into a flourishing future.
Well, wonderful. Well, Dr. Steve Turley, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Tim. It's my pleasure.